In this video, I'm going to talk about the moral and ethical philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And so first, just a few points about what is ethics, as ethics is the major object of Kant's philosophy. So ethics and moral philosophy studies questions related to responsibility, freedom, our duties to others and to society, and whether or not we're free when we act in such and such a way. Were we free, or were we determined by some force that we had no control over? And the word itself, ethics, comes from the Greek word ethos, which means habits. So the idea is if you study ethics, then you can figure out what kind of habits you need to cultivate to live a good and happy life. So, moral philosophy, which is a kind of part of ethics, deals with moral dilemmas and difficult questions that we might encounter in our lives when we're making all sorts of decisions or faced with situations that might not have an easy solution. Moral philosophy tries to address these things, and ethics and moral philosophy are not just intellectual exercises, but can have an importance on medical practice, public policy, scientific research, but even our everyday lives. Everyday life can turn to ethics for help. And so some of the primary questions of ethics are the following ones. So, is there such a thing as good and evil? Is good and evil something that is made up, or is it something that exists in nature? Or is it a mixture of the two? Is it something that societies create, or is there some divine being that we have to follow? And furthermore, ethics asks questions like, is there anything that I ought to do in order to live a moral life? To be a moral person? Is it even possible to be a moral person? Why talk about this? Ethics also deals with the question, is there such a thing as a natural moral law? Or is all morality socially constructed? And finally, are we free to make decisions? Do we actually possess freedom? And if so, what does it mean to be free? So Kant was a German philosopher during what was known as the Enlightenment, European Enlightenment, and he sought to address all of these questions in his books and his articles and his lectures. So just a little background on Kant. He was born on the 22nd of April, 1724, in the Prussian town of Königsberg, which later on in the 20th century became part of the Soviet Union. And his philosophy was very much related to the French Revolution and some of the political debates that were taking place as a result of the French Revolution across Europe. And Kant was very much in favor of the general ideals of the French Revolution, which involved the freedom of thought, the separation of church and state, and the creation of independent republics based on nation states. Kant was very much in favor of this. He believed in a type of philosophy known as rationalism. Rationalism has its roots in Descartes. Even way back in the Greeks, it has its roots in Plato. What is rationalism? Kind of brief general overview. So first, it's the belief that all human beings possess reason the ability to use their mental and intellectual abilities, and that everything that can be known is rational. That what we know and the type of truths we can know and the type of scientific propositions we can make are made using reason. And Kant was very much a believer in science and the ability of science to do this. He thought that that was one of the routes that you came to possess knowledge. And because all humans possess reason, all human beings are equal. Although some have argued that Kant's ideas were also very much tied to the development of colonialism around the world as a result of big European powers like Spain and Portugal and France. And Kant himself believed that everyone had the ability to use reason, that no human being was inferior, and that everyone possessed an equal capacity to know. And he thought that human beings are born with this capacity, that he has what they're called a priori concepts. So these are concepts in your mind. They're abstract concepts. And these a priori concepts, according to Kant, make it possible for you to know something, to make judgments about the world. And Kant thought that these a priori concepts are important for ethics because they're what allow us to make ethical judgments. I can know that such and such is the right thing to do because I possess a priori concepts which my reason allows me to use. My rational abilities allow me to use that. And so Kant thought that I could make moral judgments because I possess reason, and furthermore because I possess innate concepts related to reason. So we'll get to that in a minute. I don't want to say too much more about rationalism. What I want to talk about briefly is one of Kant's primary predecessors in the field of ethics, one of his main kind of both influences but also adversaries. And that was the Greek philosopher Aristotle, and the ancient Greek philosopher, that is. He was writing hundreds of years ago in ancient Greece. And Aristotle wrote a book called the Nicomachean Ethics. And in that book, one of Aristotle's main purposes was to help us to cultivate virtues. And Aristotle thought that when you study ethics, the reason why you study ethics is so that you can cultivate a virtuous disposition. That whenever you act in such a way that you've acted virtuously. So what does it mean? What is a virtue? So in Aristotle's philosophy, a virtue is a kind of golden mean between two extremes. And what Aristotle wanted to do was to help you to learn what is the golden mean for each behavior, each virtue, between two extremes, and how can you cultivate this virtue? So to give a few examples. So take the virtue which Aristotle thought was very important, of courage. Right? So courage for Aristotle is a kind of middle ground between cowardice on the one hand and rashness on the other hand. So for Aristotle, a courageous person is someone who, on the one hand, isn't too fearful, right? They have some ability to stand up to fear. Because if you're a coward, according to Aristotle, then you'll be so caught up with fear that you won't be able to act at all. That kind of extreme level of fear prevents you from acting in a way that's moral. But on the other hand, you also won't act too rashly. So a rash person, for Aristotle, is someone who just kind of mindlessly acts without assessing the situation, and they kind of want to be macho, this kind of bad behavior that you want to kind of show off and just jump into a situation without thinking it through. Aristotle thought courage, a courageous, virtuous disposition, is one between these two kind of extremes. You're neither too afraid, you have some fear, but the fear doesn't prevent you from acting. But on the other hand, because you don't totally lack fear, you're also not acting rashly. And this courage then allows you to rationally respond to a kind of difficult and maybe scary or challenging situation. And so Aristotle had a whole set of virtues that you could cultivate. Just to list a few. Temperance, pride, good-temperedness or joyfulness, honesty. Each of these, for Aristotle, are kind of golden means that you can occupy. And so his whole book and his whole philosophy was designed to help us cultivate virtues. And Aristotle thought that if you cultivate these virtues, then you could come to live a happy life. You'd be a happy person. The more virtuous you are, the more happy you are. And Aristotle did emphasize happiness. On the one hand, happiness is a kind of pleasant state, of course, but for Aristotle, it's much more a state of being content, being kind of okay with the world around you, not being overwhelmed by it. And this is because you're virtuous, because you occupy this golden mean, this middle ground between each situation. And Aristotle thought that this was what would make you a happy, kind of peaceful person, and a good person, someone who could be dependable and respond to each situation. Okay, so Kant was he liked Aristotle, but he was very critical of Aristotle. And there were two major reasons for this. Number one, Kant didn't think that virtue was the object of moral philosophy, and he didn't think that ethics had anything to do with with virtue. He didn't think that ethics had anything to do with becoming a virtuous person. So that's the first reason. He thought that virtues are the object of what in his time was called anthropology. Now, for Kant, anthropology is not the study of ancient societies, but anthropology is rather the study of human beings and their dispositions. And Kant thought that virtue and the study of virtue was the object of anthropology. And he didn't have anything against being virtuous. In fact, he thought a virtuous person might be very helpful to society, to the state, to other people. He thought you could be very happy as a virtuous person, but he didn't think that virtues would make you a happy person. It did make you a moral person. He didn't think that being virtuous would make you moral. And because morality for Kant is the object of ethics, therefore virtue isn't related to ethics, because he didn't think virtues would make you a moral person. Now there's a reason for this. He thought that a virtuous person, someone who's very courageous, very maybe even honest at times, nonetheless might not have good intentions or motives in terms of how they're acting. And their virtues could even be used to commit certain evil crimes. So that's the first reason. Kant didn't agree with Aristotle that virtue is to do anything with ethics. The second reason that Kant disagreed with Aristotle was Aristotle very much thought that by being virtuous you could be happy, but he didn't think Kant didn't think happiness was the purpose of ethics. You study ethics not so you can learn how to be happy. Kant very much disagreed with this. He didn't like this idea. So that's one of his first predecessors, is Aristotle. And he didn't agree with him. Now the other people who Kant is very much disagreeing with are those who are called utilitarians, who we'll look at as well, sometimes also referred to as consequentialists. So a consequentialist is someone who says we should base our moral ethics, our moral worldview, our moral doctrine on the consequences of our action. So when we're faced with a moral dilemma, according to Kant, we should always answer the following question: what will bring the best possible outcome and the least harmful consequences? And furthermore, what will allow us to maximize the pleasure of as many people and minimize the pain of as few people as possible? The primary reason why Kant disagreed with utilitarianism was in Kant's philosophy. Kant thinks that you should base your moral decisions solely on rational principles that you construct using reason and on which you base your decisions. Kant did not think that you could base your moral decisions on an evaluation on the consequences of a particular situation. So, for example, suppose you're in the current coronavirus crisis. Suppose you're a doctor, right, in a big hospital. And in the hospital, of course, lots of coronavirus patients are coming to the hospital and in the IC. And the problem, of course, arises that there's only a kind of limited amount of beds in the hospital. And so you, as a doctor, are faced with a problem. The problem is that there's not enough beds, and there's all sorts of people that need care, but at this precise moment, there's not enough beds. What do you do? How do you act? Do you let some people die in order to save many people? Or do you try to save them all somehow using, I don't know, whatever means, but in other words, is it justifiable to allow some people to die in order to save a larger amount of them? This is the kind of moral dilemma. A consequentialist would answer in this situation, well, if the consequence is such that many people can live because a few people die of coronavirus, then that's the road you will have to take, right? Now, Kant, as we'll see in a moment, would be very much opposed to that, in fact. Kant would say, he would say you shouldn't look at how many people are going to die or how many people are going to survive or the consequences. You should rather ask a different question, and that question is it ever morally justifiable to allow someone to die? Do we have a moral responsibility, a moral duty, irrespective of the consequences, to save and preserve life? Is there any justification for allowing people to die? Now, Kant would answer no. He would say abstractly, no, there's never a situation in which you can allow people to die. And I'll look at this in a moment. The reason why, according to Kant, is that he would say, well, imagine a situation in which I can allow a few people to die in order to save a few people. And further, imagine if I did that in every single situation. Surely there must be a situation in which that wouldn't be beneficial. And Kant's reasoning is that if you can find such a situation in which it wouldn't be beneficial, then you should never in fact do it. Because you can't universalize the principle, allow a few people to die in order to save a lot of people. Because according to Kant, a moral principle is something that has to contain the element of universality. You have to be able to universalize it and carry it through to each single situation. Okay, this is probably very confused at this moment. So I want to leave it now for a moment and come back to it and just kind of conclude with the point that for Kant's other second predecessors is utilitarianism or consequentialism. The people that say you should always base your moral doctrine on the consequences it has on society. So Kant disagreed with Aristotle and consequentialists. These were his two primary kind of adversaries that he had. So I want to say now a little bit about Kant's ethics, right? So Kant wrote quite a few books on ethics. One of his longer works is called The Critique of Practical Reason, which is part of his three big critiques. But his major work on morality is a book called The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, which you'll be reading. Just a small little book. And the purpose of this book was to actually present the arguments contained in his larger book, The Critique of Practical Reason, to a popular audience. And I think there's a sense in which Kant very much wanted to make his work accessible to average working people around Europe. And now, if you've read the text, you'll see that it isn't necessarily so accessible, that it's a quite difficult book. Kant's considered quite difficult to read. But that was his goal. He wanted to make his moral doctrine available to anyone. And he thought that they would be able to understand his theories if they applied their natural reason, their natural rational abilities. And this was his view. So Kant says in The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals that moral philosophy examines the laws in accordance with which everything ought to happen, although it also takes into account the conditions under which ought to happen very often does not happen. So moral philosophy both looks at what you should do, but also why often people don't do the things that they should do. And Kant thought that the object of moral philosophy, and what he calls the metaphysics of morals, is the moral law and the freedom of the will to freely choose to act in accordance with the moral law. So what is a moral law? Kant defines this. He says that the moral law is a law that, he says, a law has to carry with it absolute necessity if it is to be valid morally. Valid, that is, as a ground of obligation. So for a moral law to be moral, it has to have the kind of sound of a command. You must do this. You must act in such and such a way. And Kant thought it had to, the moral law had to be required of a person in every single situation, right? So it had to carry with it a ground of obligation. It has to have the form of, you should always tell the truth. You should never kill. It has to have this element of universality. And the reason why Kant thought that, amongst others, was that he thought that morality was something that was no different than science. So a scientific law says that such and such a law holds necessary if such and such is the case. Its necessity arises out of the fact that it can't be otherwise, right? And so a moral law is precisely such a law. It has to be the case. There's nothing that prevents you from not following it, right? So the universality of the moral law arises out of its necessity. So when I say you should always tell the truth, this is universal and necessary. And Kant thought moral maxims had to have this kind of form. And he says in his text that he says the ground of obligation must be looked for not in the nature of man nor in the circumstances of the world in which he is placed, but solely a priori in the concepts of pure reason. Right? But Kant thought that morality Every human being is equipped with a natural ability to know what is right and wrong. And Kant thought that you didn't need to look at culture, you didn't need to look at a person's ability to be virtue. You also didn't need to look at the law, because all of these things are contingent on the particular social formation into which human beings are inscribed. He thought that you didn't need those things. All you needed to do was to use your ability of reason. And our rational abilities, therefore, will give us an insight into the content of the moral law. Reason, not culture or religion, for Kant, is what determines something to be moral. And I say here religion. Kant thought that everything that a religion teaches is required of us is also something that we can simply know without religious teachers, that our purely rational abilities give us the capacity to know what is right and wrong. And as you can see, in some sense, this is also very much in line with the kind of Protestant thinking of Kant's time, that you don't need a whole kind of religious institution to tell you what's right and wrong. Kant thought you could use your rational abilities to decide this. And this was one of the reasons why he was very much in favor of the separation of church and state. He thought that a state would be best organized if it relied on a set of moral principles that all of its citizens would have to follow using their rational abilities. He didn't think you needed the church or any kind of religious institution to do that. So finally, Kant thought that concepts such as universality, identity, and necessity are what ground moral judgments. So Kant didn't think you needed to look into a person's psychological disposition or the consequences of a particular action to decide whether or not a person's moral. Rather, you needed to look at the moral principles that they're relying on and whether or not they're universal. And if they lack this, then Kant says we may describe a person as being good or evil, but whether or not they're moral is another question, and is not knowable based on a particular circumstances in which a person's thrown into. Okay, so let's, looking here at my notes. So Kant says that to become a moral person, it's not enough simply to reform oneself. So sometimes people at a certain time in their life start thinking, well, I want to be a better person. I want to help more people. I want to give more to the poor, or I want to do more kind things for people. I want to reform my behavior in order to become a better person. Kant thought that this was not actually the way to become moral. He thought that it may very well be that you're trying actively to do more moral acts, but Kant says that because you're trying to reform specific behaviors and actions, Kant says this actually isn't going to make you moral. And when I read a quote from Kant, he says, if a man is to become not merely legally, but morally a good man, this cannot be brought about through gradual reformation, so long as the basis of maxims remain impure, but must be effected through a revolution in the man's disposition. He can become a new man only by a kind of rebirth, as it were, a kind of new creation. So Kant thought, in order to become moral, you had to undergo a kind of subjective moral revolution. In some ways, for Kant, this is very much related, again, to the kind of ideology and ideas of the French Revolution. That it wasn't enough to reform the state in France as it existed, to make the aristocratic more democratic, or more in favor of some of the ideas of the Jacobins in France, but that the only solution to changing social problems was through a revolutionary break with the past and a kind of recreation in the present moment of something totally new. And so Kant thought that in order to become moral, you had to effectively undergo such a kind of moral revolution. Kant doesn't really specify necessarily what this would entail, but one of the ways in which we can think about this moral revolution for Kant is a kind of sudden decision that you're going to live your life and live every aspect of your life in accordance with reason and rational principles. So instead of saying, well, I'm gonna try to be a nicer person, or I'm gonna try to help people more often, you don't really focus too much on how you're going to reform your acts. Instead, you make a kind of decision, once and for all, that you're going to live solely by reason, and that you're never going to act unless it conforms in accordance with reason and universal rational principles. So let's look now at what Kant considers to be moral. So in the text, the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, as well as the longer works, the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant makes an important distinction between acting in accordance with duty and acting out of the sake of duty. So Kant thinks that to be moral means to do what you must do, what you are obliged to do in accordance with the moral law, right? So acting in accordance with duty. So let's look at a few examples here. So suppose I decide that I'm always going to tell the truth, but because I don't want other people to get hurt. Because if I tell a lie, maybe it will hurt people's feelings, or someone will, in the end, I'll end up getting discovered, and this will cause me more pain. Kant says that's very good. That might be a good reason to tell the truth, but that doesn't make you moral. Now, Kant thinks it is your absolute duty to always tell the truth. The main reason for this is Kant says, well, imagine a situation in which it wouldn't make sense to lie, in which lying would actually harm society. Kant says if you can envision such a situation in which it would be harmful to lie, Kant says that in that situation you should never do it. You should always tell the truth. So that I am not lying because I can find a situation in which it wouldn't make sense to lie. And therefore I'm always going to tell the truth. So telling the truth becomes a kind of moral duty for Kant. And Kant says that only if you act, if you say, I'm always going to tell the truth, only then, and you do this, you actively do this, only then can you be said to be a moral person. If you let the circumstances in which you find yourself determine whether or not you're going to tell the truth, Kant says then you're not moral. You may still be a good person, but you're not a moral person for Kant. And I'm going to read a quote here from Kant. Kant says that acting in accordance with duty, but not for the sake of duty. About this, Kant says, an action done from duty has its moral worth, and not in the purpose attained by it, but in the maxim in accordance with which it is decided upon. It depends, therefore, not upon the realization of the object of the action, but solely on the principle of volition, in accordance with which, irrespective of all objects of the faculty of desire, the action has been performed. So the idea is, the job of ethics is for you to use these rational abilities to kind of sit and decide, what are some principles that I have to follow in order to be a moral person, right? And to kind of distinguish between the things that I have to do and the things that are more or less up for debate, right? So I'll give you another example. Suppose that you see a person that is very much in need, a homeless person. They're begging for money. And suppose you say, okay, I'm going to charitably act and give them money because it makes me feel good. And I like to maximize this feeling of pleasure and also help others. Kant would say you're not moral at all. There's nothing about you that's moral, because what's causing you to act, your motivation, is this kind of personal gain that you get out of it. Even if someone else benefits from your kind of selfishness, Kant thinks that selfishness shouldn't figure into whether or not you decide to help someone. Instead, Kant thinks you should try to decide if the principle, always help people when they're in need, is a moral principle. And if it is, then you should just do it. And Kant thinks that in that case, if you're faced with a person in need, you'll either say, okay, here's the money, you receive my kind of charitable gift, or you decide, no, I'm not going to help you because it's not what I should do. This is kind of Kant's approach here. To give another example, so suppose you're really miserable and depressed and that you're really ill. You've got a severe life-threatening illness. And you're faced with the question of, should I undergo euthanasia, depending on whether or not euthanasia is legal. Suppose it's legal, and you have the choice to, with the help of the doctor, to end your life. Well, Kant says that the question of whether or not you should do this, there's two approaches to this, right? So suppose you say, well, I'm still not gonna end my life because I'm afraid of death. Even though I'm in lots of pain, I don't want euthanasia because I'm afraid of death. Again, Kant says there's nothing moral about this. Instead, again, Kant should say, do you have a moral duty to preserve your life? Or would there be a situation in which ending your life would not be the right thing to do? You could probably think of a situation in which indeed it wouldn't be the right thing to do. I don't know, maybe you're stranded in the wilderness with some people and multiple people have already died. And there doesn't seem to be much hope, but there is a slight chance that you could find a way to survive. But there's not much hope. In that situation, you could end your life, but actually it probably wouldn't make sense to do so because there is still the chance that you could survive. And in that case, preserving your life would make more sense than ending it. And again, Kant says because you can find this situation in which it wouldn't make sense to end your life, Kant says you shouldn't do it then. It's not the right thing to do. Preserving your life is thus a kind of moral duty. So to summarize then, how can we know what our moral obligations are? What are our moral duties? So as I said, Kant thinks the moral law is something rational. This means that every moral principle is a command that tells you what you should do or should not do. And the way that you determine this is first and foremost connecting a particular situation to the universal, right? So I look at this particular set of situations and try to find a case in which it would or it wouldn't make sense to do something. And then on the basis of this, I can kind of decide whether or not it's a universal principle that I could find. And so Kant says if I cannot universalize a particular action, right? For example, if I can't universalize the principle, it's always okay to lie, or it's okay to tell a lie in this situation, but not that one. Kant says then it's not rational, and you shouldn't do it. And therefore, Kant says the things that we must do um, are the only things that are effectively moral, and those things will always be universal, right? Now, I want to make a point here. It's probably, at this point, maybe a little confusing. Um, Kant doesn't think that ethics is necessarily about deciding everything that we should or shouldn't do. It's much more a kind of discipline of sitting down, critically using our rational abilities, and deciding what is absolutely required of us. What are the main primary principles that we should follow, on which we base our life and our actions? So, and I want to come to the conclusion now. So, and what Kant calls this is the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative says the following things. Kant has 3 or more formulations for it. He says, I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law. So I should only act when I'm faced with a challenging situation or a moral dilemma in such a way that my action can become a universal law. Right? If it cannot become a universal law, then I shouldn't do such a thing. I'm not required to do such a thing. Another formulation of the categorical imperative is act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. Right? So as you can see, Kant thought that the moral law is something that's accessible to human beings at all times and all places, irrespective of the society they live in. And that is because it's something rational, and since all human beings possess this rational ability, all human beings have access to it, and all human beings should be able, using their rational abilities, to distinguish right from wrong. And it should therefore never be based on consequences. The consequences of a particular action shouldn't be what determine me to act in one way or another. Rather, the moral principle that I decided even before I was faced with the moral dilemma are what I should rely on when making moral decisions. Okay, now I want to, that's Kant's philosophy, but I want to now lay out a kind of difficulty that arises from Kant's philosophy, and quite a striking one, and it's been to some extent the subject of many jokes and kind of humor around Kant's philosophy for many years, over a century. So Kant believed that we have a moral duty to always tell the truth, irrespective of the circumstances. We should always tell the truth. So if someone asks us something, we must tell the truth, irrespective of what we tell the person, irrespective of the consequences that result from that. So Kant gives you this situation, and this is the kind of famous murderer situation. Kant thought that we should tell the truth even to a murderer. So Kant tells you to envision a situation in which a person knocks on your door and says, "Oh, could you please hide me? I'm being pursued by a murderer." The murderer is pursuing this person. And you say, "Okay, quick, come inside and I'll hide you." You hide the person in the closet. And maybe 15 minutes later, Kant says, now another person knocks on the door, and that person is the murderer. Now, for some reason, Kant thinks it's okay to open the door in this situation, and Kant opens the door. And of course, the murderer asks, "I'm looking for this person." Of course, it's the person who you're hiding. And could you please tell me where is this person? Do you know where this person is? And Kant thinks that in that situation, you have a moral obligation to tell the truth, to tell the murderer where the person is. So you should, yes, I'm hiding the person in the closet. Now, obviously, that raises a serious issue with Kant's whole philosophy, because, maybe the person will die as a result of that, and two, it seems to maybe draw, but to an extent, it can be explained in Kant's own reasoning. The principle "you should always tell the truth" seems to not, in fact, hold, because there is indeed a situation in which telling the truth would not make sense. But the problem is, there's also probably situations in which telling the truth would itself be irrational. So the problem is Kant's whole reasoning around this moral obligation kind of breaks down. Kant had an argument, though, why you should tell the truth. He says, if I tell the killer the truth, that such and such the person is in the closet, the killer might not believe me and look somewhere else. So he says, I can't really know what the murderer is going to do. It may very well be that the murderer says, well, thank you for your honesty. I'll stop pursuing the person. It's also true that if I tell the truth, yes, I was hiding the person in the closet, that the person already escaped through the window as I was speaking with the murderer at the door. So Kant says my intention to tell the truth is really, in this case, what matters. I can't really be held accountable for what happens because I don't know how the murderer is going to take my answer, right? And Kant he had some bizarre reasons for believing in this view that we should tell the truth to a murderer. One of his views was based on what's called social contract theory. Kant thought that society is held together by a kind of social contract, and the principle holding that social contract together is honesty and truth-telling. And that if one person lies, then it calls into question the whole social contract. Kant thought that the very act of killing was less severe than telling a lie, and the main reason for this was that if someone kills someone, then only one person dies. But if you tell a lie, it calls into question the very foundation of society, the social contract, and therefore many people could die and suffer as a result. And therefore you have a kind of duty, because of the social contract, to always tell the truth. Now, one criticism of this comes from the Slovene philosopher Alenka Zupančič, who says that actually, yes, okay, maybe there's a kind of social contract, but we have a legal system. And one of the elements of the legal system in a society is to punish people who don't follow the terms of a contract. So if you lie and you're contractually obliged not to do so, there's a kind of state apparatus that might punish you as a result of this. And the whole reason why we have this kind of legal system is so we don't have to rely on the honesty and truth-telling of individual people, right? So Kant's argument that we should tell the truth because otherwise it could call into question the whole fabric holding society together is itself deeply problematic. Now, one reason Kant might have believed this is because he spent his entire life in a fairly small village called Königsberg in what was then Prussia, and it may very well have been that in his little still semi-feudal kind of social formation, the social fabric was very much held together by people's honesty. But it's questionable because the Prussian state was a very kind of absolutist and powerful state and had a whole legal system backing it. So It's questionable whether this is even the case. But that is one of the problems with Kant's philosophy. There is a kind of almost inevitable problem that you get into these kind of ridiculous situations in it. Okay, to conclude now, I think the kind of value of Kant is, number one, Kant thought that morality should be based on principles. And I think that this is a very powerful thing today. In our kind of contemporary society, it's very common for people to have a kind of consumerist and attitude towards their lives and towards the decisions they make. It is indeed often the case that people make decisions solely based on pleasure or individual gain, without really taking into account the kind of larger social consequences of their actions. Of course, Kant was not in favor of a consequentialist approach, but what is indeed the case is that the individual circumstances into which people are thrown very often determine the decisions and choices they make. And for kind of a lot of people today, morality is very much a kind of morality of the contemporary moment. And it tends to be a very individual, selfish-based morality. And I think one of the values of Kant's ethics is that it bases morality on a set of principles. And those are principles that govern your actions and govern your lives. And I think this can be a very powerful moral theory if it's kind of adjusted. I think the issue with Kant is that it's maybe too absolutist. It's too much, you must do this, irrespective of the situation. But I think there's a kind of maybe more flexible approach to Kantian ethics where you, for yourself, and maybe not just for yourself, but for society, and maybe for a group in society, or for a collective in society, or even for the laws governing a future society that doesn't yet exist, and to think of a set of principles that will govern that, rather than basing everything on the kind of consequences and individual outcomes of each particular situation. I think that is what is very powerful about Kant. And I think Kant's ethics is very much the ethics of commitment. Someone who's very committed to something lives their lives by principles. You can see this in the work of political activists who, like Martin Luther King, for example, or Malcolm X, people who in the face of extreme adversity, who faced the most incredible difficulty, who were oppressed by all the forces in society, nonetheless persisted in their principles to the very day of their last days. And in the example of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, both of them knew they were in danger. Both of them knew that their lives were at stake. Malcolm X particularly knew he was very likely going to be assassinated for his views by people close to him. And this didn't scare either of them because they had principles of revolutionary justice and social justice that gave them the courage to continue fighting for a better, more just society, free of racism and other forms of oppression until the very last days that they lived, right? And so I think in some sense they embodied a kind of ethics similar to what Kant is advocating.